should be recording. Got a couple more people to admit, and we're screen sharing. Okay, so hello everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Joel. I'm the director from the Illinois Prairie District Public Library. We're super excited to have Elizabeth Rusch here to talk about You Call This Democracy, all the way from Oregon, not Portland. I made that mistake. What's the city?
Newport.
Newport, Oregon. Okay. And so we're super excited to have her here. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction. Everybody should be muted, but if you're not, if you can look and just mute yourself, that'll help us. And then we'll be able to share the screen. And then if you want to pop into the chat with any questions that you have, you're welcome to do that throughout the presentation. And then I do have the questions that were submitted by the readers. We have a lot of questions. I don't know that we'll get to them all, but we'll do our very best. So let me read this introduction. Elizabeth Rusch became interested in our democracy while watching the U.S. Senate in action during an 8th grade trip to Washington, D.C. Rusch has a master's in public policy from the University of California, Berkeley, and has served as a Jacob K. Javits Fellow in the U.S. Senate, but she is better known for her award-winning books for young readers. Her work has been recognized by the ALA, NCTE, NSTA, Kirkus Reviews, SLJ, the Junior Library Guild, the Subaru Prize, and the New York Public Library, among others. Rusch is also the author of more than 100 magazine articles. Spurred by what she learned from writing this book, Rusch has begun advocating for democracy from her home in Portland, Oregon. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and it's your turn.
Do you see my, what happened? Where'd it go? Uh-oh.
Is it?
Do you see my slide?
I don't right now.
Uh-oh.
Let me go back to this view. Does that help?
I'm going to hit share screen again. Share screen. Okay. This, I think, is what I need to do.
There we go.
There we go. Okay, I'm going to do from the beginning. Okay. Now you see that. Now does everybody see the screen? We're good?
I see a head nod, so I think we're good.
Okay. Well, thank you, Joel, so much for having me. And thank you to all the libraries who are supporting this event and all the people who are coming out to learn more about our democracy. I really appreciate your interest. And I think that our democracy needs every single one of us. So thank you for coming. So I'm just going to start. I'll just tell you a tiny bit about me and a little bit of background about the book, and then I'm going to jump right into how our democracy really works, what I've learned from writing You Call This Democracy. So I'm the kid who had a portrait of John F. Kennedy on my bedroom wall when I was little, and I used to look up at his portrait and think, like, what can I do for my country? And then I'm the 8th grader who went on a class trip to Washington, D.C., and I got to see lawmakers debating laws in the Senate, and my jaw just dropped, and I thought, it just felt so accessible. It felt like government was right here, and we could see these laws being made, and I thought that was just amazing. And so I'm, the adult who went on to get a master's in public policy, and as part of that master's degree, I got a fellowship that allowed me to work in the U.S. Senate for a year. And that was a very eye-opening experience. So one thing that I want to share is that I was actually really impressed with all the senators and all the staff people on both sides of the aisle. Everybody seemed really committed to doing what was right for their constituents and what was right for America. And that was really inspiring. But there were a couple of things about the way the Senate ran that were really quite disturbing. You know, I knew about bills that were quite popular with the American people that either were never even brought up for a vote because a senator could put a hold on a bill. So one senator from one state could put a hold on a bill, and then that bill would never be brought up in committee or on the Senate floor. And then there was also the threat of a filibuster, which could also just stop a bill dead in its tracks. So I got a little disillusioned with government and thought, well, I'm not really sure that I want to be part of this. And so I kind of took a different direction, and I became a writer and started writing books for young readers and magazine articles on all kinds of different topics. And, was really enjoying that. My husband used to tease me and say, when are you ever going to use your master's in public policy? And I used to kind of joke back and say, well, I use it every time I read the newspaper, because having the master's helped me learn about economics, and it was like a few law classes and quantitative analysis. And so I did really feel like I could read the news and have a very deep understanding of what was going on. Then in 2016, for the second time in my voting life, the candidate who won the national popular vote did not take the presidency. And that really shook me up again. And I thought, maybe there is something that I can do for our country. Maybe what I can do is take a look at how our democracy actually functions and see if I can figure out, in what ways does our democracy represent the will of the people, and in what ways does it fall short? And so that's what inspired me to write my book, You Call This Democracy. So I wanted to start by asking a question of you all in the audience. If you don't mind, just type in the chat, what issues do you worry about most? What issues do you care about when you think about, the election or laws? Like, what topics or issues do you worry about? Do you think we need to be, doing something about, passing laws, making change, making improvements? So I'll just give you a minute to type in the chat what some of those issues are that you really care about, that you worry about.
Do you see those? Do you want me to? You've got bipartisan gridlock. Can you hear me?
Yeah, if you could read them, that'd be great, because I can't see them.
I've got bipartisan gridlock, erosion of the rule of law, making the balance of powers unworkable, climate change and rights such as Black Lives Matter or immigrants being held, equality, so many of the things you covered in the book, in addition to LGBTQ plus rights and the right to choose, environmental issues, how divided we are. There doesn't seem to be any common ground, race relations, environmental issues, education.
Yeah, so those are topics that I hear when I do this talk, really common. I feel like one of the things that unites us is what worries us, what we think isn't working well in our country. My next question is, what do you think is keeping us from making progress on these problems? If to point to one thing, why can't we do anything about climate change or about police brutality? Or, why do we have hyperpartisanship? Why can we not talk about things? Why can we not make progress on, healthcare and all these topics that we care about? What do you think is standing in the way?
There's quite a few answers coming in. Several of them are money and greed, money again, unwillingness to compromise, polarization, pettiness, money, single issue stances, power and money, the belief of party over country. Those in power are interested only in their own power.
Yeah. So it's funny, when I do this talk, I get a lot of Trump is the problem, or Democrats are the problem, or Republicans are the problem, or, kind of this pointing fingers of everyone, the other guy is the problem. And, I have a kind of a different perspective. What if something else is to blame? What if it's not, one presidential candidate or one president? What if it's not one party or the other? What if it's something that is kind of easily looked and that is 100% solvable? So to kind of talk through this, one of the things that inspired me to write the book and continued to as I was working on the book is actually how much area of agreement there is among Americans about what we should do about certain issues. So Americans agree that we need to do more to help the poor. So roughly 2/3 say that the government should spend more money to support the poor, and more than 2/3 of Americans support a $15 an hour minimum wage. And this has been true for a number of years, but we can't seem to get that law passed. A wide swath of Americans agree on universal health care. More than 2/3 of Americans support a government health plan similar to Medicare that would cover everyone, but we can't seem to get that law passed. Americans agree that we should do something about the climate crisis. About 68% of Americans support raising taxes on the wealthy to combat climate change, and 60% support raising taxes on corporations that burn fossil fuels. So there's a lot of agreement, but we can't seem to get those laws passed. Americans overwhelmingly support common sense gun laws. So more than 90% of Americans want background checks for all gun buyers. And 85% want red flag laws that will keep guns out of the hands of violent or suicidal people. And this includes 78% of gun owners. So it's not even a matter of, gun owners versus non-gun owners or Republicans versus Democrats. There's a wide area of agreement, and yet we can't seem to get any of these laws passed. Most Americans want police reform. So 92% want police to wear body cameras, 83% want a ban on racial profiling, 82% want a ban on the chokehold, like the one that was used to kill George Floyd. And again, these are huge numbers. Like, I think you kind of think that our country is more polarized than it really is. If you look at the polling and what we support, there's actually a broad area of agreement, but we can't seem to get these laws passed. So my take is that the fundamental problem is bigger than all of these problems combined. And the problem is that our democracy does not reflect the will of the people. We can't get these laws passed because our democracy is not set up to use the voice of most Americans to make laws. So this is kind of a wonky little graph. This is a graph of what a responsive government would look like. So if 0% of Americans supported a law, it should have 0% chance of passing. Why would it pass? Nobody wants it. If 100% of Americans support a law, then there would be a really, really good chance of a law passing. But this is the sad reality of how our government works. So researchers at Princeton University and Northwestern University looked at polls on what Americans want, and then they looked at laws that actually passed over a 20-year period. And they found this. Basically, there's about a 30% chance of a law passing, whether 0% of Americans want it or whether 100% of Americans want it. So the chance of a law passing has nothing to do with how much support there is for it among the American people. So this is what they wrote in their report. The preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, non-zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy. So let me break down a little bit for you. What are the components that make this happen? Why is it that what we want as Americans does not translate into law? Well, a big one we're facing right now is that we don't get to vote for president. So because of the Electoral College system, the presidency has been given to the loser of the popular vote in 2 out of the last 5 elections. So what happens is that because of the Electoral College, it kind of distorts the way our elections work. Instead of every person individually going to the polls and putting in a vote and all those votes being counted up and that person becomes president, what happens is that there's a lot of attention paid to just a few states, battleground states, where it's not really clear if it's going to go, the vote in that state is going to support the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate. And so all the attention is paid to those states. And not only is the candidates more likely to visit those states, but there's actually more federal funding that tends to go to those states and more disaster relief that goes to those states. And this year there are about 6 battleground states, and that puts the other 44 states in the United States as mere spectators in this election, just wondering what's going to happen in those swing states. And what that does is it actually distorts policy as well, because candidates have no incentive to appeal to the whole country. They don't have to figure out like what do most Americans want and what platform should I put together that is going to get me the majority of the votes. They really have to find out, well, what do the people, voters in these few states want, and really direct their campaign and then later their funding to those states. And even though the Supreme Court is not an elected position, the Electoral College system actually is having a really big impact on our Supreme Court as well. Currently, 4 out of the 9 Supreme Court justices who are currently seated justices were appointed by the loser of the national popular vote. And if Amy Coney Barrett is confirmed, that's going to be 5 out of 9. That's a majority of the Supreme Court appointed by presidents who lost the national popular vote. Now, National Public Radio had a study in 2016 that said that a candidate could win the presidency with less than 1/4 of the national popular vote. So that doesn't really sound like a democracy to me. That doesn't really sound like a presidency that's chosen by the will of the people. Another problem is that we let politicians choose their voters. So when I say that, what I mean is that that there are voting district maps. So everybody lives in a voting district. So in my district, all the people in my district vote for one a member of Congress, and also elect in the state legislatures a senator and a representative. And someone has to draw those maps and group those voters. Well, in more than half of states in the United States, those maps are drawn by the politicians in the state legislatures. So and it's usually the party in power that controls it. So they can draw the maps to benefit themselves, literally to keep themselves in office. They can, grab a few voters here and grab a few voters there to make sure that they will keep their seat. And they can also draw the maps to benefit their political party. And so, again, how much your vote counts and whether, all the voters, say in Oregon or in Illinois, are able to actually kind of express their preferences and have that reflected in their state legislatures and also in their US Congress, their congressional representatives. It just doesn't happen if the politicians are drawing the maps instead of citizens drawing the maps. One of the things that really surprised me is how little of what happens in our elections actually is decided at the federal level. Most of the way elections are run happens at the state level. And how elections are run varies widely by state. Many states can implement policies that block people from voting or make it very difficult to vote. So even though there's a federal law that requires states to automatically register citizens, about half of states don't do that. And because of that, there are 50 million citizens, eligible voters in the United States, who are not registered to vote. And people who don't vote mostly say that they don't because they're not registered. So we've created this barrier to voting that when I looked at what happens in other countries in the world, most countries in the world don't require citizens to take an extra step to vote. They're automatically registered to vote by their government. But in our country, in many states, and I think including Illinois, citizens have to register. They're not automatically registered by their state. Then there are also other kind of voter suppression tactics that they can use. They can, states can have very strict ID requirements, like saying you have to have a photo ID that's state issued, that's current. And while that may not seem like a big deal, what if you're not a driver and you don't have a driver's license? What if you're older and you don't drive anymore and your driver's license has expired? What if you're a student? What if, the other kind of big question is, why do you have to be a driver to be a voter? Like, there shouldn't really be any connection between driving and voting, because voting is a right that all citizens in the United States should have. Another thing that states can do is they can take their voter registrations and just say, oh, well, you know, this person hasn't voted in the last 3 elections, so we're going to kick them off the rolls. And then that person has to re-register before they can vote, and that can act as another barrier to voting. They can also make voting easier or harder by how many polling places there are and where they are located, and whether there's early voting or not allowed. And especially now during COVID, there's a great difference happening among states where you can easily vote by mail, and in other states where you can't even get an absentee ballot, you can't even use COVID as an excuse to sign up for an absentee ballot. So that's like, you definitely, like, it's just not equal. You know, we don't all have equal access to voting. Another thing that we do in this country that's disturbing is we disenfranchise citizens based on where they live. So there are 4.2 million American citizens. So these are citizens, full citizens, who don't have full voting rights because they happen to live in DC or Puerto Rico. So I lived in DC for a few years and didn't have the same voting rights as I did when I moved to Virginia, and then when I moved to Oregon. And in Puerto Rico, you can live in Puerto Rico and you don't have full voting rights, and then you move to Florida and all of a sudden you do have full voting rights. So another thing that we're doing is we're keeping a whole bunch of American citizens from voting. We also disenfranchise citizens because of our of the connection that we make between voting and our criminal justice system. Again, this is the kind of thing that doesn't really happen anywhere else in the world. First of all, in the United States, we have such a huge prison system with so many Americans in it that this, what might seem like a small detail, actually disenfranchises a huge number of people. What happens in this country is that there are 4 million American citizens who cannot vote because of a felony conviction, and 3.3 million of them are not even in prison anymore. So we've tied our criminal justice system to our voting system, and by doing that, we've kept a lot of people from voting, and actually that disenfranchisement tends to affect certain communities more than others. And when there are lots of people in a community who aren't voting, then their kids don't see the voting happening, and then they don't grow up to be voters. And so it can have really horrible long-term repercussions. And this, I also want to say that this is in contrast to actually what, like, the corrections officers and parole officers and probation officers want. They want people in the criminal justice system to be connected to society, and voting is one way for that to happen. So it's not even something that people in the criminal justice system want, it's just something that we continue to do. And then, as a number of you noted in the earlier question, the role of money in our elections. We give wealthy citizens and corporations a huge amount of influence over our laws and our election. So that research that I told you earlier, the researchers who were looking at polling information and what laws pass, well, they looked at that information another way too. They did that same analysis with the top 90th percentile of income earners. So they looked at what the richest people in the United States want and what laws are passed. And as you can see from this curve, our government is basically responsive to the wealthy. That's the actual reality of our democracy. And this is what they wrote in their report. Economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on US government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence. So what I have learned by working on this book is that we can't fix the problems that we face in our country until we fix our democracy. So you all might be feeling rather discouraged. There were definitely times when I was working on this book when I was discouraged, in fact, infuriated, angry, when my critique group read chapter by chapter of this book. their first comment was always, this made me so mad. It made me so angry. Like, I knew this was happening, but I didn't know how much of an impact it was happening. And when you see it all together, it can feel really overwhelming. But I will also tell you that writing this book made me feel incredibly, incredibly hopeful. There are ordinary citizens just like you and me all across the country who are working to fix our democracy. One of the stories that I include in my book is of Katie Fahey. She was 26 years old after the 2016 election, and she was terrified of what was going to happen at Thanksgiving dinner because her family was really polarized, and she thought that a partisan brawl would break out. And so she decided to try to think of some topics that they could talk about over Thanksgiving. And she had done some reading, and she had learned that in Michigan, the state legislature draws the voting district maps, and that the political party in power, could draw the maps to benefit themselves. And so she asked at her Thanksgiving dinner, she said, do you think that politicians should be drawing their own voting district maps, or do you think that's something that citizens should do? And that was something that her whole family could talk about and even kind of come to agreement on, that, well, actually it makes more sense to have citizens drawing these voting district maps. So she posted something on Facebook and said, does anyone want to do away with gerrymandering in Michigan? And they got thousands of volunteers, and they worked to get a measure put on the ballot. I think she said her grandmother collected like 900 signatures. So anyway, they get this thing put on the ballot, and it passed with 60% of the vote, right? So here is a divided family who was able to make a huge difference in voting in Michigan. I also really love the story of the badass grandmas. I can say that because that's what they called themselves. So they were a Republican and a Democrat, and they did not like how much power money seemed to have in the creation of their state laws. And so they rallied support to pass a whole slew of anti-corruption laws in North Dakota. And then there are the citizens of Florida who had learned that 1.4 million ex-felons were being barred from voting even after having served their sentence. And so they also, a lot of the ex-felons themselves and other volunteers gathered signatures. In order to pass it, they had to have 60% of the vote, and they got 60% of the vote. And Florida passed a measure to restore voting to 1.4 million felons in that state. So for every flaw that I cover in You Call This Democracy, there is a clear solution. No matter what issue you care about, I believe that if you learn about these flaws and about these solutions, that we could actually fix our democracy and be able to start making progress on the issues that we all care about. So I'm going to give you just a couple examples. So the Electoral College can seem really thorny. So the Electoral College is written into the Constitution. So some people think, oh, well, we can't get rid of the Electoral College unless there's like a constitutional convention or we pass, an amendment. Well, actually, also written into the Constitution, it says that states get to decide how to allocate their electors to the Electoral College. And so there's a huge movement sweeping the country where states are agreeing to give all of their electors to the winner of the national popular vote. So there have already been 15 states plus the District of Columbia that have signed on to the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And once they reach the 270 that are needed to win the presidency, then that will, it'll go into effect, and all those states will give their electors to the National Popular Vote winner, and we'll have a presidency that's elected by the people. So there is a path forward, and these state level changes, the signing on to the compact, is definitely a bipartisan venture. There have been, Republican and Democrat state legislatures that have passed them. There have been Republican and Democratic governors that have signed them into law. There have been Republican, Democratic sponsors of the bills. And so this is something that we can do. We're actually not that far away. With gerrymandering, the solution is to have citizen commissions that are either nonpartisan or bipartisan and clear non-gerrymandering guidelines. And as you heard in Michigan, this is something that citizens can put together and do. And we had an effort like that in Oregon. We were gathering signatures to have an anti-gerrymandering measure put on the ballot, and we were getting close, and then COVID hit and we weren't able to get enough signatures this time around, but I'm sure we can the next time around. You know, we can do something about voter turnout and make it easier for Americans to vote. We can have automatic voter registration that is not tied to the motor vehicle department. The government knows already our addresses and our names and can automatically register us. We've had vote by mail in Oregon since I think 2000, and it is the most respectful way to get citizens voting. So what happens in Oregon is everyone's mailed a ballot at your own time, your own choosing. You can read through the voter pamphlet, you can look up issues online, you fill out your ballot, you stick it in a security envelope, you stick it in the other envelope, you sign it, and you stick it in the mail. And it's something that you can do whether you have mobility issues, whether you're a student, whether you have a job, whether you're sick, whether you just, you know, it's just something you can do on your own time. And one of the things that actually I'm quite hopeful about with COVID is that a lot of states are embracing vote by mail because of COVID. And what I'm hoping is that people will learn that it's actually a really respectful way to have citizens vote. I'll also say that I mention in my book, I cover, there's been a fair amount of research on vote by mail, and it is incredibly safe. It is not any more susceptible to voter fraud than any other kind of balloting. And so no matter what you're hearing in the news, look up the research. It's a super safe, super secure way to vote. So as Joel and I were talking about earlier, I wrote this book with all these issues. Each chapter is a different issue, like the Electoral College and gerrymandering and the role of money. And I started to wonder, because all these happen at a state level, like what happens in my state? Like, how democratic is Oregon? And then I also have family who live in Illinois. I have family who live in Maryland and in California. I grew up in South Carolina and Georgia, and I really kind of I went to school in North Carolina. I really wondered, so what happens in all these different states? So I realized that there was a limit to my book, that I had looked at the issues, and I even had maps. But if you wanted to know, say, has Illinois passed the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, you would have to look that up on that chapter and then look at every other chapter. And so what I decided to do is to put together a website called youcallthis.com. And I put all the information, all the data that I had about these issues, and I organized it by state. So you can go to the 50 State Democracy Report Card and you can click on Illinois. And this is actually what you'll see when you click on Illinois. So Illinois is a spectator state. That means that you're not necessarily one of the battleground states that gets a lot of attention. You're just like Oregon, you just watching the presidential election happening. 49% of eligible voters in Illinois do not vote. That's actually pretty standard across the board. I think there's only one state that's not actually failing in terms of voter turnout. So some things that Illinois does really well is you guys have joined the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. You have automatic voter registration, and I don't know if this is recent or not because I did update with COVID, but you have pretty generous access to vote by mail right now. But there are some things that I think could be done better in Illinois. Currently, Your voting district maps are drawn by politicians, not citizens. So, supporting an effort for a citizen commission to draw the voting district maps and offer non-gerrymandering guidelines for that maps would be a great way to improve democracy in your state. Limiting the influence of money is something that, Illinois allows a lot of individual contributions and also corporate contributions at the state level. And I don't remember, I'd have to look up the details, but I can't remember if there's also disclosure. Another thing that you can do is just require that there be full disclosure of all donations. At the very least, we should know who is donating to candidates and to certain campaigns, at the very least. And then, as with every other state in the union, I think there can be a lot more done to kind of get out the vote, to get people voting. I wanted to highlight a couple of really important dates that are coming up. November 2nd is the last day to request a ballot in Illinois. The first day, so ballots have already been sent out, but will continue to be sent out. And you can already vote in person in Illinois. So one of the things that I hope you take from this presentation is that small improvements in our democracy could lead to a huge leap forward for our country. And this is something that I don't think is going to happen because the politicians are demanding. And I think it's going to happen because the citizens say, we want and we need our democracy to work better. And there's a lot that you can do personally to make this happen. So one thing is just to learn about these issues. I have a master's in public policy, and I learned a ton by writing this book. And, like simple things like that, what happens at the state level really matters. And so, while it can be really, a presidential election can kind of sweep up all of our attention, and it is important. There are also things happening in your local government and your state government and those representatives that you're also electing who can have a huge impact on how democracy runs in your state. So I really encourage you to think about democracy not just as a presidential election race, but think about all the other elections that can affect the smooth running of our democracy. I encourage you to go to the democracy report card and find out, more about your own state. I also have a section called Get Involved, where you can find organizations that, support citizens who are making change. Like there's a group called Represent Us that helps pass anti-corruption legislation. The League of Women Voters is usually really active in these issues. And then the last thing that I encourage you to do is to become a cell phone citizen. So what I mean by that is that we have 5 representatives whose job it is to represent us. So we have our 2 senators in Congress, and then our representative in Congress, so that's 3. And then in your state legislature, there's usually a senatorial kind of representative, and then more of like a House of Representative kind of representative. So there are 5 politicians whose job it is their job to represent you. And so we have this really powerful tool that we carry around with us all the time called a cell phone. And in that cell phone, you have a contact list. So I suggest that you take, 5, maybe 10 minutes tops is all it would take to find out who your 5 representatives are, and then put them in your cell phone, put in their name and their email and their phone number. And then when you learn about these issues and when you think about what you'd like to see in Illinois, contact them, send them an email, send them a text, call them and tell them what you think should be happening. And you can do this with any issue that you care about. Our democracy is only as good as our voices are, and we need our voices to be heard. And yes, we do need structural change for that to happen, but I also think that citizens could be more active in expressing what they want to their representatives whose job it is to represent us. So as you can tell, I'm somewhat passionate about these topics, and I've created lots of resources to help people learn and understand and think about and discuss these topics. So I have a website called youcallthis.com where you can get the 50 state democracy report card. It also has lots of discussion questions that can be used in classrooms, and debate questions that could be used by debate teams. I also have created a series of really fun short videos called Flash Course on Democracy. My son is a sophomore in film school in LA, and when COVID happened, he came home. So I had a filmmaker in my household, and I had this book that had come out in March. And because it came out during COVID, it wasn't getting a lot of attention. So I thought, well, what are some other ways that I can get these ideas out? So we've created 4 videos on things like the Electoral College and gerrymandering and vote by mail and voter turnout, and we're working on a 5th. They're about 5 minutes long. They're kind of modeled after John Green's crash course on democracy. So they're really fun, and I hope you enjoy them. Share them with people young and old. So to wrap up, I just want to make sure that that my core message here is clear. I really think that together, Republicans and Democrats and independents can really shape a democracy that reflects the will of the people. And that by doing this, we can finally make progress on the issues that we all care about. And I think that we can cut through the partisan, hyper-partisanship, and we can actually start getting things done. And I think that this is what our country really needs. So thank you so much for caring about your democracy, for spending time, listening and learning. And I really appreciate your time and your interest. And we can take questions now.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. I wish we could like clap or something, because the end feels a little bit weird with these things, virtual and all that. But do feel free to chat some questions if you want, and I do have a bunch of them that I got from people that had signed up before. One of them, Elizabeth, is do you think the issues that you examine in the book, do you think that one of them should take a top priority in tackling to move toward a more just democracy? Is there one that should be our top priority?
One, I think what's tricky is that they're, each one on their own, like they affect this number of people. It's like, 44 states or half of states or 50 million people. And, they all, it's almost like when you add them up together, that's where you just kind of get the whole system, doesn't really reflect the will of the people. So I really like a kind of a multi-prong approach, like Jeff Merkley, who's a senator from Oregon, has kind of a vision for like, well, let's make sure that voting is a right. Let's install automatic voter registration. Let's get vote by mail going. Let's just do it all. Like you could have one piece of legislation, that actually covers everything, and it's called like, let's fix our democracy bill or something like that. So, I guess if I had to just say one, I think the one that bothers me the most is the fact that we make people jump through a hoop to register to vote. And I think because when you look at other democracies in the world, that is so rare, and the fact that there are 50 million Americans who are not registered to vote, that just getting those people registered to vote, what I'd love to do is see them registered to vote, and then a ballot shows up, right? And they're like, hey, what's this? And all they have to do is open it, think about it, learn, and like stick it in the mail. Like, I think that I want to hear what those 50 million Americans want. I think that we need everyone's voices to move forward in this country. So I think if I had to pick one, it would be automatic. And I don't think it should be tied to driving. I think that's just absurd.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. The next question that we just got in by chat is, how has COVID complicated the democratic process, and what can we do about that?
Yeah, so there are so many interesting things about COVID. So as I mentioned before, a lot of states have moved toward vote by mail, which I hope that that continues, that they keep that access to voting by mail. after COVID. Another interesting thing that's actually kind of positive is that because of COVID, a lot of young people have moved home, and it's like, I think there was like 3 million young adults moved back in with their parents and grandparents, and they're the largest number of young adults living at home than since the Great Depression. And research has shown that young people are much more likely to vote when they're at home and when they see their parents voting. So there could actually be a benefit of an increase in turnout in the youth vote, in the younger vote, because of COVID. My biggest, I don't know if I would call it a concern, but I know that because of COVID, it's going to take longer for people to vote, and it's going to take longer for us to count up those ballots. And so one thing that I think is really important is that Americans don't expect to know who won the presidency on election day or even the next day, that we really are going to need time for all those votes to be counted. And, it might be a week, it might be several weeks, but what's most important to me is that every vote be counted. I also know that Oregon has had vote by mail for a long time, and it's very smooth, and we'll probably have our results really early, but there are a lot of states that have had to move to vote by mail really quickly, and they don't have the infrastructure to for that to happen smoothly. So I expect it's going to take a while for us to find out the results, and I think that we need to expect that, and we need to be okay with it, so that we don't rush it, and that we can make sure that all the votes are counted.
Yeah. Now I think this is a question that I had also, but you just mentioned the younger population voting. Oh yeah. So your book speaks to the fact that 8 million citizens are ages 16 and 17. Should they be allowed to vote, and why do you feel that way?
Oh yeah. So that was one of my favorite chapters to write, partially because I have teenagers. So I have a 16-year-old and a 19-year-old now. And also just because, just watching the news and really hearing the voices of young people of what, that they want attention paid to climate change, that, they want things to be done with Black Lives Matter. I feel like the youth voice is so strong, and yet they're not allowed to vote. And so I collected all kinds of information about youth voting, and how there are so many young people that have jobs, that are paying taxes, that drive, they do all these things that sort of responsible adults do, and yet they don't get to vote. And there are a few places in the United States where they've extended voting to 16 and 17-year-olds for local elections. And there are places around the country where younger people vote all the time. And so I really looked at what would it look like if young people were voting? What are some of the criticisms? One thing that people worry about with young people is that somehow that they don't have the cognitive capacity or the engagement to vote. And what the research shows actually is that by age 16, you have two kinds of cognition. This hot cognition, which is you're with your friends and at a party, and you're trying to make a decision there. And then there's cold cognition, which is where you have time to kind of weigh the pros and cons and think about things. And 16-year-olds have just as much cold cognition as 18, 20, 25, 26-year-olds. So they have the capacity to vote. They care, they show up, they volunteer at higher rates than any other age group. They've done studies that show that they know just as much about democracy and about candidates as 18 to 25-year-olds. And so I would love to have the vote extended to 16-year-olds. I think one of the most important aspects of this is that if you get 16-year-olds voting, that's going to happen for the most part when they're still home and they're still in high school. And so we could create a habit of voting with younger people instead of having 18 be the first year that people vote. 18 is a really tricky time. It's a time when a lot of people are leaving for college or to start their own apartment and their own job, and it's a really tumultuous time. It's actually not a great time to have people vote for the first time. So I would love to get that habit of voting started earlier, And I think we would have much better voter turnout in the long run. And I want to know what the youth think. So much of what happens in the world affects them, and they are more than qualified to make decisions and to have their voice heard. So yes, I am all for the youth vote.
This one says, getting proper representation is hard. What do you think if we would expand the House of Representatives to reflect a better part of the nation? Could that be part of the solution?
Yeah, I think that there's a little bit more of a problem with representation in the Senate than in the House. The House is a more, well, it's more representative in the sense of the numbers, right? That there's a more of a connection between like the population and, you know, how much of a voice you have. Whereas in the Senate, it's, you have two, whether you're, you know, whether you live in Wyoming or whether you live in Texas, and the population differences are just massive. And so that's a real distortion of, I mean, I think the Senate is more of a distortion of democracy. And I have a section in there with, you know, a proposal that talks about, you know, expanding the number of senators and instead of having them be statewide races, that they, you know, if you run it differently, that you can become more representative. If the question is about representative in the sense of being more representative of gender and of race, you know, I don't know. I do think that part of the problem is incumbents, right? That we already have a lot of, you know, white men in office, and it's very easy for them to stay in office. And by opening up and having more races, you may have more access to seats by doing that. I think that that there's not an easy answer on the question of how to have a more representative government. I think that the political parties need to do a better job of reaching and inviting people of different genders and of different races and backgrounds to become candidates. I think public funding of campaigns would help a lot. You shouldn't have to be rich to run for office. Rich or connected with rich people to run for office in this country, but you absolutely do. So I think that there's some other things that might be more effective.
Yeah, that's great. Just got this question. What are your thoughts on term limits in the Senate and the House? Would this make a difference addressing the issues that you raise?
You know, I couldn't point to term limits and say that term limits don't represent the will of the people, right? I mean, with the book, I was really kind of looking through the lens of, you know, one person, one vote, and in what ways do we not live up to that principle? And when I think of term limits, I mean, I think getting rid of them would be going in the wrong direction, because then you're not as responsive to the will of the people. But I also think that making them really short, the thing that concerns me about that is how much time and money is spent campaigning already. Right. And that in some ways candidates would just have to raise money more frequently and be campaigning more. And actually what I want people not to be spending their time campaigning and raising money. I want them to be legislating. I want them to be listening to what people want, what people in their district want, and working on those policies. And I think that those kinds of changes are going to come more with campaign finance reform and, you know, limiting contributions and, you know, and publicly funded campaigns.
Yeah, that's great. We're right at an hour. Do you mind if I give you one last question? It's kind of a fun one that I just saw. Someone submitted it, and then we can end there. Maybe, if it's a good ending, we'll see. But I think it's a fun question. It's, is there another country that does democracy better than us that we should look to as a model for change?
Oh, one country that does it better. That's a really complicated question, because there are so many different kinds of democracies. So we have like a representative democracy, and it's a presidential representative democracy, and there are other ones that are like parliamentary. What can I say about that? I mean, there are lots of other countries that automatically register people to vote, and I think that's something that we should absolutely do. Canada, basically like as a nation just did away with gerrymandering, just said it's illegal to do, period, anywhere. So they fixed that problem like that. So there are lots of examples of other countries, making changes that, just immediately fix a problem. And I would like to be able to do that too. I mean, I know I focus a lot on this state level, but another route could be, a Senate and a U.S. House of Representatives that puts together a bill that's just pro-democracy and makes all changes on the federal level. I'd love to see that. So I don't think there's one democracy that I know of that I would just point to. I would just say there are pieces of it here and there.
Yeah.
And that when the way we do it is not the way that everybody else does it all the time, which is also can be, I think you grow up in a democracy and you think, well, this is the way it has to be done, and this is the way everybody does it. And that's just so not true. And we can really make it work better.
Yeah, that's super great. Thank you so much for this. We really appreciate it, and we had a lot of great information right before the election. So we'll be sure to make use of it, hopefully, and maybe make some of these changes that you talk about. So thanks for joining us tonight, and thanks everyone that tuned in. And we'll have the recording available for those that couldn't get here. So thanks again, Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and thank you all for showing up for democracy. We need every voice. Thanks.
Have a great night.